Hey guys, Dr. Tammy here. Let's talk about hair. I had a request to talk about cortisol and hair loss, but it can be much more complex than just cortisol. There's lots of hormones, and all the hormones interact with each other and the interplay. So I'll try to be brief, but let's just talk about how do you diagnose hair loss, and then we can understand what's causing that, and then we can understand the treatment. Because unless you understand the underlying cause, then you're just going to be banging your head trying to figure out why it's not working when you are looking for solutions. I always say a headache is not an aspirin deficiency. Something is causing it, right? So if you have hair loss, something is causing it. And the bigger picture is that the hair loss might be an indicator that you have a health problem that you need to address that could be serious. And so, yeah, it's terrible, and especially with women, I think more so. I could be wrong about that, but when you start losing hair, it can make panic. And then that panic makes higher stress levels, which can increase the hair loss. So it's really important that you have your power back, because if you're stressing more and more about it, it's just going to make it worse. So I want to give you some simple ways to know where the hair loss issue lies. And amazingly, just by looking at somebody's head, you can tell. Okay, so just like with hormones, I can look at someone and I can tell where they gain their weight, where their metabolic imbalance is. And so if you gain weight around your belly, that's usually a cortisol issue. If it's in your hips, an estrogen issue. And so there's lots of different ways that you can look at the body and you can see where the imbalances are. So you can look at the hair too. So if you are thinning all over your head at a rapid rate, basically, or a new rate, that's usually a thyroid issue, and that's addressed very differently than a cortisol or a nutritional or anemic reason, right? So if you are losing hair just on the crown of your head, that's usually a form of testosterone called androgens that's causing that. And it's not particularly the testosterone that's the problem. It's the endpoint conversion of testosterone into a hormone called DHT. It has a longer name, but we'll leave it DHT. And so that male pattern has a genetic component to it. The genetic component only means that a lot of, especially men, because men have more testosterone than women do, but that your testosterone is more likely to convert into DHT based on your genetics and lots of other things, including other imbalances too. Okay, if you have patchy hair loss all over the place, just here, strange spot back here, your beautician says, "What is that?" That is usually cortisol. So we'll talk a little bit more about cortisol because that was the request of this video. But understanding the different problems that come up with cortisol could help you find the solution, right? If you're losing hair around the temples, interestingly enough, that could be an estrogen or a progesterone issue. And men and women have all the same hormones. So, yes, a man could absolutely have an estrogen or a progesterone issue. Normally, we see this in pregnancy because of the estrogen progesterone imbalance. As things progress, women get more and more progesterone because progestation, that's the hormone that promotes the pregnancy. And so, also, when those hormones get imbalanced, is a time of life called menopause. And we see a lot of that. So you'll see women, their hair's receding back. And so that's usually an estrogen or progesterone issue. Of course, the way I fix that is I put all my women on bioidentical hormones if they're a candidate for it, right? But that's something that we definitely talk about. Okay, if your hair is breaking and it's brittle, that is usually, or if it's breaking off at the top, that is usually a thyroid issue as well. Thyroid slows down the metabolism when it's not working properly or it's not the right level. And so basically, as it grows out, it's so dry and it's so brittle that it breaks off really easily with processing or hair dryers or curling irons, those kinds of things. Okay, and the last one, if you pretty much almost noticed it overnight, hair falling out, whoa, my brush is full, that's a thyroid issue. So another whole video for another day would be to talk all things thyroid and hair. So we could definitely do that. But let's break this down into 3 different main causes, and then we'll kind of kick into cortisol a little bit more. But with cortisol, usually we think of high levels of stress. Cortisol is absolutely a normal, beautiful hormone. It keeps the balance with our ability to handle stress. So when we have high stress over time, and that could be a boss yelling at you, or that could be environmental stress, alcohol, any kind of, chemicals in our food, all sorts of things can cause stress. So what happens is we have three different phases to our hair growth. The first one is called anagen, and that is the growth phase. And then we have catagen. You don't need to know these, but that is the transition phase in between the growth and the rest phase. And then we have telogen, which is the resting phase. And one of the interesting thing about having these different phases is because they happen in different cycles, and it can take weeks to months for a cycle to shift over. And a lot of times we'll see women who will have a sudden change. They'll go into menopause early in their 30s because they had a huge stressor. There was a family emergency shift, or something horrible happened. They'll go into menopause and their hair will fall out. So very common with a very high stress situation, because what's happening is that growth phase is being stunted because of the cortisol response. And so cortisol basically is responsible for shifting back to the growth and to the rest phase. One of the things, and we now have an IPL laser in our office and we do hair removal, is that if you get them at a certain time, you might get somebody in a growth phase, you might get them in a transition phase or a rest phase. So sometimes you have to do it in stages. So a lot of times people are like, I'm just going to get my hair all lasered off, and it's like, but then they hit another growth phase and they're like, it didn't work. So I always tell people, this is a process because we got to get all those phases. So understanding that may help you understand that if you have a cortisol issue, absolutely we have to get to the bottom of this stress. Also, blood flow is another big thing. So we'll call that number 2, which nutrients can't get to the hair follicle if you have constricted blood flow. And cortisol can do that because cortisol is a stress hormone. It's telling the body fight or flight. And if your body's in stress mode and it is in fight mode, the last thing that your body is worried about is getting vascular supply to your hair. I mean, literally, like most women are like, yeah, that hair is like a huge priority. But when you're in fight or flight, or when you're dealing with crazy people, or the world is on fire, then your hair is going to be the last thing. So getting those nutrients there, constricted blood flow, also contributes to heart disease and vascular disease as well. But that is usually a nutrient issue getting into the flow. Okay. There is number 3 is telogen effluvian. And basically what's happening is the hair is just not growing. It stays in a constant rest state, and then it will fall out because the follicles just can't sustain that resting state very long. And a lot of times we'll see this with thyroid problems as well, because you'll get dermatitis, you'll get breakouts, nutritional deficiencies like zinc deficiency and B vitamin deficiencies. And so you don't have the nutrients to the hair, and now you have a cortisol vascular compromise. So it's a perfect storm. One of the other things too is low iron. And so if you have low iron, you need that iron to have the oxygen flow to the cells and to that vascular flow and to the hair follicles. So iron is actually a part of the hemoglobin, the red blood cell, that carries the oxygen. And so if you don't have good iron, you're not going to have good oxygen carrying processes. So a lot of times we'll see this in GI issues where people aren't absorbing their iron, or we'll see it in somebody's having menstrual cycles or GI bleeding or something like that. So, okay, let's kind of back up a little bit and talk a few more reasons for hair loss. Number 1 can be low thyroid. And when we see that, how does thyroid cause hair loss? Well, here's the interesting thing. Thyroid actually decreases your body's ability to clear your cortisol. So we call that cortisol clearance. So if you have a lot of cortisol around, thyroid is actually needed to get rid of that cortisol. So low thyroid can lead to increased cortisol accumulation because it's not being cleared out of the body. Most of the thyroid conversion happens in the liver, where all these hormones are converted, as well as the liver is like a big cleaning factory. So if you're not clearing those hormones or clearing those toxins, that can be an issue too. Okay, cortisol can inhibit a hormone called TSH. TSH is a hormone that tells the thyroid what to do. So if you're inhibiting that hormone, I think of it like a mom telling her kids to clean the room. So if you have a low thyroid, usually it's because the feedback from the brain to the thyroid is not working properly. So if the thyroid's not working, the mom's going to send messages, hey, keep cleaning your room. Come on, you're not cleaning your room. And she gets louder and louder and louder. And so that TSH is supposed to tell the thyroid to make more, but cortisol can interfere with that through something called the HPA axis. So that's the adrenal, the pituitary, and the hypothalamus all talking to each other. So there won't be a quiz on this. So you don't have to know all this. I'm just saying all these hormones are interrelated, right? And so you can't just look at one and not understand that there's a whole lot more going on, which is one of the reasons that I do extensive lab testing, and we do a full thyroid panel. We do estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. We do iron levels. We do B vitamins and D vitamins. And so all sorts of things. So, I mean, you really can't just in isolation say, oh, I'm just stressed out and this must be a cortisol problem. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's actually pretty simple when you get down to looking at just the few things that could be causing a problem. One of the lab tests that you can also do for hair loss and low thyroid and iron is you can look at something called ferritin. If you have a lot of stress in your body, ferritin can be increased just from the stress. So it can be a little misleading, but ferritin, if it's low, can tell you that you're not adequate with your iron stores. And so be careful. Don't just run out and get iron if you think it could be an iron problem, because you can get what's called iron overload, just like you can get too much vitamin D, anything too much in excess. So it's really good to get testing. And cortisol can affect the inactive thyroid conversion to the active thyroid conversion too. And autoimmune conditions will often reflect in T4 and T3 conversion problems, and cortisol can interfere with that. So that can be another thing. And cortisol can actually cause something called thyroid resistance, where you have plenty of thyroid hormone on a blood test, but it's not converting and it's not getting into the cells and it's not working properly. So one of the ways you can tell with thyroid resistance and hair loss is weight gain that comes with that too, because all of the metabolism is slowed down and that growth phase of the hair is slowed down too. So I know this was a lot of nerdy science, but let me just wrap this all up in a big, pretty bow. And that is that looking at the hair patterns can tell you a lot about what's going on. Looking at blood work, looking at symptoms, and then looking at the person as a whole. If they've had weight gain, if they have night sweats, if they have GI issues and they're not absorbing their nutrients. So it really needs to be a comprehensive approach. And it's not just as easy as, rubbing some Propecia or something on your hair, because you stop using that and the hair loss continues, right? So if you don't get to the underlying cause and you're just going to throw big pharma at it, or you're just going to keep struggling, then that's a problem too. So I just love you all very much. I want you to have the most beautiful hair and the most healthy life and feel wonderful and feel confident in the skin and the hair that you're in. And just wish you all the best. And I hope this was helpful. Mwah.